I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it, and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. All right. So what grabs your attention as we get started?
Still nice to see the rainbow.
It sure is. It sure is.
This is probably not the best version, but
It
says the creatures of the earth, not flesh. So
Flesh is probably the more literal rendering there, but what's meant is creatures.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not just people. All things have flesh, right? All the creatures that have flesh here, including us.
Insects too?
Yeah, they have flesh.
Oh.
Yeah. I kind of wish they didn't. I wish he hadn't made that covenant with the mosquitoes, but
Yeah, but they're food for some reason.
Well, they are. I know. They're part of the food chain. Yeah, I know. I just don't like when I'm part of their food chain. So. I'm used to being on top of the food chain. I prefer not to be.
Lower down.
I prefer not to descend. Yes. A colleague of mine at seminary used to have a shirt. His fiance got him. He was from Texas. He was a barbecuer, and he had a shirt that said, "I didn't claw my way to the top of the food chain to eat vegetables." What else grabs you?
Well, it's reassuring to know that this covenant is with us.
Yes.
Even though, many, many, many years later, shall we say, all time.
Absolutely. Yeah. The covenant is that with us, and by extension through us to the creation. And so we're back to that first principle we see in the Genesis 1 text, where we've got God placing us in the temple, in creation, as his image. We are the caretakers, the priests, okay? And so as it goes for us, so it goes for the creation. Now, this will be picked up by St. Paul in Romans chapter 8. This is, when I say picked up, not from this specific text, but it's a consistent theme throughout the Old Testament, from Genesis 1 on. What we do in our relationship with God affects the creation around us, because we are the mediators of the covenant between God and creation. And so when we sin, creation suffers. Okay? And this is what St. Paul's going to pick up in Romans 8 when he talks about all creation's groaning as a woman in labor pains, waiting for our adoption. Meaning, nature continues to suffer. Creation continues to suffer. All the privation and want and all the things that we think of as natural are not pictured in Revelation 21 and 22. None of that's there anymore, right? It's not there in the prophet Isaiah when he prophesies the end times and things like this. In fact, one of the regular texts we read at our funeral services is from the prophet Isaiah, where he talks about God destroying on this mountain that covering that's over all creation, right? And that's the shroud of death. God's going to take death out of the equation. I don't know how nature works without death. My only familiarity with nature is as food chains, right? Mm-hmm. I loved documentaries as a kid, but you watch a nature documentary and I can tell you what you're going to find the animals doing. Killing each other and making babies. That's what they do. Okay? That's the cycle of nature as I'm familiar with it. But a renewed creation is not going to function in that way.
And it makes you wonder, at least makes me wonder, what was Eden really like?
Yes.
Is what we have after Noah something different from what is almost like this is a second creation? I mean, is it?
Well, it's a fallen creation, right? Or a cursed creation, right? So as we looked at Genesis 3, what you had was this foundation of we are under a curse. Humanity's under a curse, or under the, depending on how we remember, we talked about that. Is it a curse or is it prescription? It's whatever it is. We're in a situation we wouldn't be apart from our ancestral sin. But creation gets cursed by us being under that sentence. Cursed is the ground because of you, God says to Adam, okay? And so it's interesting here that the covenant is made with all flesh. The picture that we got from Eden, and it's probably in some of your study notes, is that likely human beings were vegetarians. Well, likely so was every other creature. So carnivorousness follows after the fall. And again, there's been some really interesting reflections about how that functions in terms of natural history. A book I strongly recommend to you is by Michael Behe. It's called, I think it's called The End of Christianity. But it's a play on words. By end, he means the completion. The word in Greek for end is telos. And it means end, but a better way to say it is its destination, or completion, or fulfillment. So he's playing with words there. What he means is this is the destiny. What Christianity is pointing us toward is not what we can unearth in the archaeology. It's not what we can unearth in the fossil record, because the fossil record is this long history of death, right, by definition. We're digging up bones. We're pointing us towards a different kind of destiny for all of creation. So what's interesting to me here is that the covenant is made with all flesh. It's not made with the plants. So plants will continue to be food, is kind of the picture we have in the book of Revelation. In fact, right at the center of the heavenly Jerusalem is the tree with 12 fruits, and we're to eat from, and this kind of thing. That's the tree of life, which we didn't eat of in Eden. So in that book, he talks about how do we reconcile these two pictures, what we know from the archaeological record and what we know from the scriptural record. And he is a true and devout believing Christian. His solution to that problem is very interesting. It's basically the church's answer, but the church's answer to how the cross works. So for us, we have history going on from here, right? So beginning to end, okay? And we are in the middle. So in the middle of the story, we experience a lot of things. One of the things we experience in the middle of the story, somewhere between the beginning and end of the cross of Jesus, right? But in the book of Revelation, I mentioned this in my Easter sermon, we see the Lamb standing as though slain from the foundation of the world. That's a fascinating phrase, slain from the foundation of the world. What that's saying to us is that Jesus is not actually killed here. This is where we experience him as being slain. We experience this because for us time goes this direction only, right? It's an arrow. But for God, he has access to all of time at once. So for God, from God's point of view, Jesus is slain before the foundation of the world. This is when it enters history, is at the cross. Now, what the church has always said about this is, how did all these Old Testament people get saved? Moses wasn't perfect. He wasn't even allowed to enter the promised land because he sinned. So if we're all saved by the blood of Christ, how are we saved? Well, because although we experience the cross here, where eternity intersects with time, Christ is slain from the foundation of the world. The Son has been submitting himself to the will of the Father from the very foundation willingly. giving himself for the sake of our sin. So that even though the cross happens here, because you'll find some Christians cut off from the historic reflection of the church will say things like, no one got saved before Jesus was raised. Everyone before that's damned. That's never what the church said. The church always realized, since the Lamb was slain from the foundation of the world, the cross works both directions in history. The blood of Christ covers all those who are faithful to God, even though they didn't know that God would become a human being in a person named Yeshua in the first century. The prophet Isaiah was looking forward and knew that's what the whole focus of the book of Hebrews is about. In that wonderful chapter about the great cloud of witnesses, he goes through this list of all these Old Testament saints, and he's like, we're more blessed than they were. They had to take it on hope that this was coming. For us, the hope has already arrived, and so we're looking backward for our salvation. They were looking forward, but the salvation comes in the same way, through Christ. Yeshua in the flesh. Okay? So that's what the whole focus of that book of Hebrews text is about. That it's all those Old Testament saints, they're saved by the blood of Christ the same way we are saved by the blood of Christ. Okay? And even though they wouldn't know to call him Christ, or there was certainly, I say Christ, that's his title, Messiah. They wouldn't know to call him Yeshua. Okay? They would know that salvation comes from Yeshua. And of course, that's what the name Yeshua is the name Yahweh with other letters put in to change the pronunciation. That's why it translates to Yahweh saves. Okay, so all these pieces work together. Yes.
Is that part of the when Jesus goes down to hell and,
yes.
and rescues all the people?
It's preaching to the spirits in prison is what is.
Prison,
well, that's the reference there is to what we would think of as hell. That's why if you look in your green book on a Sunday morning when we're saying the Apostles' Creed, it says descended into hell, and there's a little asterisk by the word hell, and you can also translate from the original, which was written in Greek or Latin, descended to the dead instead of descended into hell. Both are perfectly acceptable translations of that original word there.
Some churches actually say dead.
Yes, churches who take, especially because progressive Christians don't like to talk about hell at all. A lot of the churches have moved in the direction of talking about the dead. That would not have, for the Christians who authored the Apostles' Creed, have eliminated the possibility of hell. It simply would have meant that, for lack of a better word, there was a holding space. Mm-hmm. Which is very much what Dante gives us in his Inferno, right? The first ring of hell, no one's getting tortured. First ring of hell, nobody's suffering. This is the place for the good pagans. Okay, they did nothing deserving suffering, but they also didn't hope in the Messiah. They didn't have faith in the Messiah. This is why his guide through hell is not Beatrice, it's Virgil, the great poet of. If you're an Italian, he's your patron saint artistically, right? Virgil was even though he was a complete hack and just ripped off Homer and Ovid. Yeah. But that was Dante's ode to his artistic inspiration. But he was a pagan. He wasn't a Christian, and so that's why Dante puts the pieces together that way. In the tradition of the church, a lot of times that passage from Peter is interpreted as basically anyone who lived before the coming of Christ giving the option to follow him, which they didn't have in the flesh. Or revelation to them if they were the Old Testament saints or whatever. This is why the icon of the resurrection has whom Jesus is lifting out of the coffins is Adam and Eve, because they're those who need to look forward and hope, and because they're our ancestral parents, they represent all of us by definition, being lifted out of the grave. Again, icons tell the story symbolically; they don't tell the story literally, which is why you need to learn how to read them, is learn how to write them. I've shown you guys the icon of the resurrection, right? I've shown you guys the icon of the resurrection?
you showed us some ideas, I don't remember if that was one of them.
I'll tell you, at the end, I'll go grab it before we go to chapel time, and we'll bring it. I got one hanging in my office, so it's one of my favorite icons. In fact, I've got it on my backdrop of my computer right now, but it's covered with other stuff, so it's not very fun to look at. Okay. What else grabs you?
God bless Noah and his son.
Mm-hmm. Yes, 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 yes.
Never again will life be cut off by waters of the flood.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, and again, waters representing the primordial chaos. That's the opening line of Genesis. Right after God created the heavens and the earth, it's the Spirit of God moved over the face of the waters, that chaos that God's going to bring order out of. This is the return of chaos. The humanity was choosing chaos for itself, but God's not going to do that anymore. This becomes an educational moment for us, what God could do. It's important for us. It's important for us to remember, when we talk about God as love, that doesn't mean God is soft. In the modern world, we tend to associate love with sort of weak affirmation of somebody. And that's not a robust enough love to pull somebody out of addiction, for instance. Okay, having addiction in my family. I know what it takes to help pull someone out of addiction. And bland affirmations that you're okay and I'm okay won't cut the mustard. So God is a much more robust form of love than we are. And with that is a love for justice. Because justice is what we all desire for ourselves. We want mercy for ourselves when we've committed evil. We want justice for ourselves when evil's been committed against us. Well, how do you square that circle when we're all being unjust to one another? God's love for justice is because of his love for us. And so this gives us a picture of judgment, of the return of the chaos. Should God remove his protecting hand from us? Because that's what we've had since Cain and Abel, right? We've had this sort of protection over Cain. This is what happens when God removes the protection. The chaos returns. There's a decent number of really interesting, and I would call not particularly alarmist people, beginning to say, hey, you know what? It's looking like God's removing his protecting hand from over the West, because a lot of this weird spiritual stuff we're seeing going on looks exactly like some of the cultic worship of some of these ancient pagan gods that got pushed out by Christianity returning. Particularly the goddess/god Ishtar in particular. So, which is not where we get the word Easter. So don't go on Google and have somebody say Easter's just Ishtar changed to Christian. No, it's not what it is. Anyway, okay. Other things.
So eternal covenant means forever?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And again, covenant being a little different than a contract. Contract is something that's formed between equals. A covenant is between a superior and an inferior. There's also a form of reciprocity in the covenant where, in a certain sense, responsibility falls more on the superior party than the other party. That will be important when we get to chapter 15 of Genesis. We'll talk a lot more about covenant when we get there. Yeah. There's a fair case to be made to read the Bible as a series of unfolding and embedded covenants, larger covenants, smaller covenants placed within larger covenants, and how they play out. There's a pretty good case to be made for that. So. Other things. So did you pick up that the bow in the cloud is a symbol of war?
Oh.
God will no longer make war against his creation. He's hanging up his warrior's bow for us all to see that he's not taking it up again. Yeah, that's a soldier's bow. Again, in the ancient world, the crossbow hasn't been invented yet. A bow is the most fearful thing you can imagine because it can strike at a distance. Spears are worse than swords because they're longer, and bows are worse yet. The biggest armies in the world, which would have been around this time, would have been I think the Akkadian Empire was the big empire. Certainly by the time these are being written down, you've got the Persian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, these different ones. But both the Assyrians and the Egyptians, what were they famous for were their chariots, right? That was your big war thing. Well, the guy in the chariot didn't wait till he got close to cut you down. Someone was driving the chariot at top speed, and someone else was standing there with a longbow going after you. So it really was like the ancient form of a tank. You had the best weapon you had available in the turret, and if you got close enough, it would run you over too, just like a tank. Okay? The tanks were actually, there's a reason why, to this day in the Army, the tank squadrons are called cavalry. Okay? Because they replaced horses. But for most of history, war horses and the chariots they pulled were the worst thing you could see coming on the battlefield. Foot soldiers had no chance. So God is hanging his bow up and vowing not to make war anymore against his creation. And we've reduced the rainbow to a sort of sentimental thing, as opposed to a sign of an eternal covenant. Anything else?
Well, I think there's something reassuring about the whole section.
Mm-hmm.
Because when God makes a covenant or a promise, he doesn't break it.
Yes. Yes.
Is that we do.
Yes,
Yeah.
but we do. That's right. That's right. Again, be very important when we get to chapter 15. But yes, absolutely. Because part of a covenant process is the attestation of what happens should the covenant be broken.
Mm-hmm.
And it always involves the suffering of the less powerful party if the covenant gets broken. Okay? So yeah, that God is making this covenant, and really, he doesn't make any conditions. He doesn't say to them, here's what you have to do in order for me to keep my covenant. Okay?
It's different than when when Moses tells the Jews all of the conditions.
Very
He
different.
also tells them what's going to happen if they don't. Yeah.
Exactly.
So this is a lot different.
It's very, very different. And that's what makes the Sinai covenant fundamentally different than the covenants we see in Genesis. Both this covenant and the covenant we're going to see in Genesis 15 made with Abraham are of a fundamentally different character than the Sinai covenant. The Sinai covenant follows a pattern that everyone in the ancient world would have been familiar with, which is here's the what's called the suzerain king, here's the vassal king, down a little bit lower. They make an agreement, and what happens? The suzerain king agrees to provide protection for the vassal king. The vassal king agrees that if he doesn't stay loyal to the suzerain king can destroy him. Okay? That's what happens at Sinai. Everyone would have recognized that kind of covenant from meaning all the surrounding nations to the Israelites would have recognized that covenant and said, hey, we know how that works. That's similar to the covenant we made with Marduk. We know how that goes. Or Baal or whoever, right? But these covenants are without precedent in the ancient world, where God says simply out of benevolence, I will do this, and he makes no stipulations on the lesser party involved.
Thank God.
Yes. And so you can think about this. This is a little prelude to what we're going to get into extensively in chapter 15. But it's an interesting reality, and Jewish scholars have talked about this, is why, for some reason, the covenant with at Sinai, they're both covenants with Yahweh, but why the covenant at Sinai has produced so much more, it has held such a firmer grip on the Jewish imagination than the covenant with Abraham. When the covenant with Abraham is more fundamental. Okay? So like I said, if you see Scripture as a set of nested covenants, you've essentially got the creation story itself. And the covenant God makes with creation is to place his own image within creation. That gets broken. Now we're here at this covenant. This is the covenant made with Noah. That God will no longer make war against his creation. And this is going to be the covenant made with Abraham. Okay? When we get to chapter 15, creation suffers because of our breaking of the covenant. Because we are in God's image. And so that image, that we mediate the covenant there. So it's suffering not because of anything it did, but because of what we did. Then God makes a covenant with Noah and makes no requirements of us because we're already failing. He makes a covenant with Abraham. We're going to talk about, that's in reaction to some of the stuff we've already covered. Remember Genesis chapter 6 where we talked about the sons of God, the fallen angels and stuff like this, right? So what we're going to, by the time we get to the fall of the Babylonian Empire and the covenant with Abraham, we're in between there. That's going to fall right in here. What's going to happen is that the Babylonian Empire, after the collapse of the Babylonian Empire, all the nations disperse and angels are given territory and they betray God. And so they all fall into idolatry, all the nations do. So God picks somebody to oppose the empires of the world. And makes a covenant with him, and in that covenant requires nothing of him. Then, what's going to happen after the Exodus story is we're going to get the Sinai covenant. And we're going to see again, by virtue of the Sinai covenant, that humanity can't keep its end of the bargain. And it's going to become very, very important that God keeps his, particularly this one. Because what's going to happen, nested within this covenant, is going to be this covenant. Right? The new covenant is not a fulfilling of this covenant. Although Jesus will come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but fulfill them. Remember, they are nested inside of a larger covenant. The new covenant is God's fulfilling of the covenant with Abraham. Okay? Which in turn is a fulfilling of the covenant with Noah, which in turn is going to be a fulfilling of the covenant with all creation. Because the telos, the ending of the new covenant, the end destination of the new covenant, is not simply our salvation. It's the renewal of all creation, which is what Paul talks about in Romans 8 and what Revelations 21 and 22 points to. All these pieces come together in one great crescendo as the scripture comes to an end. But the new covenant is the fulfillment of all these other ones that preceded it. But the new covenant's still being played out. We haven't yet gotten to the end of it. Which is why St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that whenever we celebrate the Eucharist, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. We don't proclaim his resurrection per se. We're proclaiming his death because it's his death that renews. It's his death that is the sacrifice that renews all these covenants. Okay. And when we get to the Sinai covenant, to your point, Dave, what do? They take all this blood and sprinkle it all over the people. Right? Blood is used to seal the covenant, and so we're proclaiming Christ's death and receiving the gift that is for us when we receive the Eucharist. So, all right. That was a little bit of a rabbit trail there, but that's all right.
So you circle Abraham.
Yeah, remember, these are the different covenants, they're nested inside each other. Creation, promise to not destroy creation is nested inside that. The promise with Abraham happens within the creation that's not going to be destroyed again. Then the covenant at Sinai happens within the covenant with Abraham. And then finally, the new covenant occurs in the context of all the failures of the Sinai covenant. God comes along and does what he did with the Abraham covenant. He actually fulfills the Abraham covenant, as St. Paul points out. When in that passage that Lutherans love to quote about by grace, that when St. Paul goes to the Abraham story, he talks about it being the seed. It's the seed of Abraham, not the seeds. And St. Paul gets into this real in detail, right? That it's not all the people that come from Abraham. It's the one person who comes from Abraham that brings the fulfillment of the covenant. That one person is Christ. But that's for our Romans Bible study somewhere down the road. We'll do a little detour into that when we get to Genesis 15. All right. Noah's descendants. Verse 18. Unless you have any other questions about what we just read. Okay. Verse 18. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew that his youngest son had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. All right, so what grabs your attention?
How much,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
how much shorter the lifespan is. Like,
Yeah,
that's
they're
crazy.
gonna. That's gonna come up very quickly here, where God
crazy.
shortens the lifespan up. Yes.
950?
Yeah.
How do they really document that? How do you figure that out back then?
This is the history as it was written down. So
That's
you know,
crazy.
yeah.
950 years old.
Yeah.
And did he have?
No, go ahead.
Did he have joint issues or like stuff like that?
We really get no details. We really get no details.
Arthritis?
Well, maybe when we get there, we can all get in line to talk to Noah and ask questions. You know.
Is the time span, right, excuse me, measured the same way today as then?
It's by this point it seems to be. I think you can make a good case in the Genesis 1 chapter that they're measuring time differently. I don't think that can be as much the case here. This seems to be, for lack of a better word, regular time, even though, as we talked about, that mytho-historical genre they're telling the stories in.
I take it that Canaan was born on the ark or shortly thereafter?
When it says he was the father of Canaan, what that means is that the Canaanite people were descended from him. So that doesn't mean he's literally the father of a person named Canaan. That reference in this particular verse is to the Canaanite people. Although we will go into their, as we start the next chapter, you're going to get their lineages, right? And Canaan is in fact one of his children. But you know, that's I'm getting at is that the reason for putting that little mark here at the front of the story, rather than waiting for the genealogies later, is so that as an ancient Jew hearing this story, you're going to know, even before we get the action of verses 20 to 24, Ham's the bad guy. Mm-hmm. Okay? You're going to know that right away because you know what his descendants turned into.
So, why do you curse the son of the person who committed the deed?
this is harder for us to understand in the modern world because we tend to think in terms of individualism. We are an anomaly in that way.
Oh.
Really, modern people that tend to think of ourselves primarily as individuals, or people in general as individuals, are historically in a tiny minority compared to the rest of world history. What was most important about you was what tribe you belonged to, where you were born. Mary Magdalene's name refers to where she was born. Okay, it's and I only know the phrase in Latin. I'm sure there's other phrases. There's probably one in Hebrew, but I don't know it. But have you ever heard this phrase, the paterfamilias? Father of the family. That's what that means. Pater is father. Okay. As it went for the head of the clan, so it went for the whole clan. Okay. Your identity. It's interesting. One of the things that frustrates people when they read ancient biographies is very little attention is paid to people's childhood. Being born after the age of Freud, we're all interested in what in the person's childhood turned them into the person they became as an adult. Most of ancient history isn't even remotely concerned about that. In fact, the only reason they recount any stories about childhood is because they were already acting like the adult they would become. So an example of this from our own scriptures, right? Remember, Luke is telling the story of Jesus. He's a Gentile, not a Roman he's a Roman by a Gentile, not a Jew by birth. So he's not interested in the childhood of Jesus, other than the one incident where his parents leave town and he doesn't go with them because he's in his father's house. Well, what does that point? It's because it points to his identity as an adult that he recounts the story. But we get no childhood stories of Jesus. The only people who wrote down childhood stories were fiction writers in the 2nd century called the Gnostics, who came up with all kind of things that Jesus did as a kid, because they were trying to claim him for their own mystery religions. Jesus became a very popular guy, and everybody wanted a little Jesus, but not a lot of Jesus. A lot of Jesus made you a Christian. What they wanted was a little Jesus to get a little of that exotic flavor for their own spiritual brew. Yeah. So that's why they recount that at the beginning of the story. Ham's the father of Canaan. That's going to let us know up front what's going to happen. What's interesting about that, the idea that, and God talks, we have, I think it's actually God who says it, that wickedness will go to the 3rd and 4th generation. Sin will continue to affect people. We know this from why are we interested in children's histories, or people's histories as children and how that affected their adulthood? Because we know that these patterns get passed on, right? I mean, it was eye-opening for me the first time I read one of the standard manuals on being an adult child of an alcoholic. Because I was. And I went right to I could go right down the page and go, yep, that's exactly how I act. Or it's how I think, more importantly. The woman who did the seminal studies in this, what she found were patterns of thinking amongst adult children of alcoholics, especially depending on where you fell in the birth order. So I was the oldest kid, which meant I was responsible for cleaning up after my mom, taking care of my brothers when she was drinking. And so that creates a pattern of behavior and thinking. And that gets passed on, which is why alcoholism tends to skip a generation, because they're still doing the same behavior patterns just without the drinking. One, like my brother, is a complete teetotaler. He's never had a drop of alcohol in his life. I never expect he will. But he has a lot of the same control issues my mother had, which led her into drinking. And so he's passed some of those along to his son. That doesn't mean his son's going to become an alcoholic, but it is why historically you see this pattern where on off, like every other generation, you get the alcoholism. It's undetermined how much of it's genetic and how much of it's behavioral, but you do see the behavior patterns passed on generation to generation. We've already seen this with Seth and Canaan. Seth's lineage has a different trajectory than Cain's lineage. With the creation of the city and the rise of wickedness, and certainly by the time we get to Lamech, we see all that kind of I can do better than God. God's only going to kill 7 people. I'm going to kill 70. So yeah. Yes.
I don't understand if why that Cain was cursed when they went backwards and didn't see their dad.
Ah, yes.
I don't understand that part.
Okay, so here's where this is called idiomatic storytelling. They're being polite. Scholars are fairly certain that this language of saying he saw his father's nakedness. Obviously, nakedness is a shameful thing, right? Already by the time, because of we see the Adam and Eve story, chapter 2, first thing when they get the knowledge of good and evil, they realize they're naked. They cover themselves up. Nakedness represents the word I'm looking for. It means you can get hurt. It's not the word.
Vulnerability.
Vulnerability. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. My brain was skipping the beat. Nakedness means vulnerability, right? So he sees his father's vulnerability here. Now, most scholars, when they look at this, especially when they look at the dimension or the size of the curse that is placed on him, they see this as being a polite way of telling one of two stories. The most likely one, is that Ham actually raped his father. So this would be a reason why Dad would wake up and be furious, right? The second and slightly lesser position on this would be that he raped his mother. Or one of the, but shamed his father by sleeping with his mother. Because the mother's not even mentioned in this story, that seems a whole lot less likely to me. But other people know ancient idioms for telling stories better than I do. I'm not a scholar in that area, so I have to trust their work. Of course, there are people who say that it doesn't mean that; it must only mean the nakedness piece, because especially in the modern world, no one wants to tie homosexuality into something negative, especially this early in the scriptures, right? It's hard enough to undo the Sodom and Gomorrah story without undoing this one too. But I've read the scholarly cases. I can give you books if you're interested, but it seems to me the most likely one here is that Ham raped his father.
But then on top of that, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
even if he just sees his father naked,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
he doesn't do anything about it, and
Yes.
he kind of makes fun of his father. You know, like,
Yes.
hey, you know what I saw? You know,
Yeah,
and
Dad's,
so that's like even worse. I mean,
it's public shaming. It's public
Yeah.
shaming of his father. We don't have the giving of the Ten Commandments yet, but this sense of honoring your lineage, honoring the paterfamilias or the head of the household is missing here. He goes and tells his brothers, like, hey, you want to go stop at
Yeah.
Dad too?
Yeah.
And they walk in backwards with
Right.
the rug and throw it over him, and so they're being more respectful of their father, even though their father had kind of made an idiot of himself by getting drunk and lying there. So this is, regardless of which of those three directions you go here, this is why Noah curses Ham. And curses his son. And by extension, their entire lineage. Okay. Now, again, if you're an ancient Israelite and you're looking at that map over there behind Jamie, you can see where Canaan is. Canaan is the country where it's going to be called the Promised Land, right? I mean, later, when God makes the covenant with Abraham, He's going to send him from the western side of the Sinai Peninsula, or west. He's going to send him from the eastern side to the western side, where Canaan is. Which means that when Abraham's descendants arrive, they're going to be in constant conflict with the descendants of Ham, the Canaanites. Okay, that's going to provide the backdrop conflict for nearly the entire Old Testament. Okay, and so this is in part an explanation story. Why do we fight with these people constantly, right? Why are we? Because they've been under a curse for a long time. And the way that this is a nested curse of Noah. Shem is basically going to be in charge. Japheth's children are to be servants within Shem's household, but honored servants, and Canaan are going to be their servants yet, one layer down. That's why they're called servants of servants. Okay. In line 25, so cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be. So it's going to go from Shem to Japheth to Ham in terms of who's in charge.
So even to this day, the Canaanites are cursed.
They're really, I mean, none of these exist as separate people groups anymore. Okay, the Canaanites don't really exist anymore, and even by the time we get to the prophets, within the Canaanites are all these other tribes, right? In fact, you're going to even see those tribes referenced in Genesis. The Canaanites cover a broad people group, and within that people group are all these subgroups. Just like within the people of Israel, you're going to have all the different tribes, right? Dan and Asher and Levi and all these tribes are going to be Jude and all those are going to be around. Same thing. You're going to have all the ites. When you get the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Jebusites and all those groups, they're all Canaanites. They all fit under that big umbrella, okay?
Jebusites.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I
Those.
don't remember anymore.
That's all right. No, we'll look at the list when we get there. You can go back to Genesis chapter 6. That's what they're listed in Genesis chapter 6. They're listed in the same way that we just had Ham references the father of Canaan at the beginning of this story. Those groups don't exist till much later in history than Genesis 6. But they're mentioned there because their lineage comes directly from the story that's being recounted at the beginning of chapter 6 of Genesis.
Didn't we say at one time that the word Semonite comes from Shem or not?
I don't know. That's a good question. Shemonite?
I don't know. The Semonite.
Like Semites, you mean?
Semite.
Semites.
Yeah.
It might be. That is likely. That sounds likely to me. What we call the Semitic peoples or the Semites are the descendants of Shem, which would include the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So the ones with the curl, really?
Yeah.
The ones with the curled, the Hasidic Jews? The ones that...
Well, Semites include a whole lot of people that aren't
Mm-hmm.
Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Jews are a subgroup within the Semite peoples. The Semitic peoples are a large people group, a large ethnicity of the ancient Near East. Yeah.
So yes.
Yes. Yeah.
I
They would
saw
be
them.
Semites.
I saw some because that's what my dad...
But in the modern world, when we talk about anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
we mean anti-Judaism.
Yeah.
Because all these people groups have blurred. A large number of the Semite peoples today would identify themselves as Christian, Chaldean Christians, people like that, or identify themselves as Arabic, typically be Muslims. But their lineage would still be Semitic. The same way like modern Georgians and stuff like that are descended from Arabs, even though they're in what we think of as the Soviet Union, or did think about the Soviet Union, I think of as Russia. They're still Arabic. And think of themselves as Arabic, right? Yeah. How people think about themselves is really interesting in light of the history of conquest, because most of what we think of ourselves as haven't existed for a very, very long time. For instance, this would be, if you go to South Africa, most of the black people think of themselves as descended from the Zulu. Those are our great ancestors, before you had apartheid and all that kind of stuff. The thing was that the Zulus came in and killed almost everyone who was there before them. So it was, the Zulus were the great tribe that wiped out all the people who I was related to and raped their wives and children so that they could have more Zulus. So it's the same way all over the world. The history of world history has been successive empires, at least for the last 2,500 years. There were certainly empires earlier than that, but they tended to collapse and be gone. But what's interesting about that is that in large part you can read the Hebrew scriptures and the New Covenant as an addition, as one long diatribe against empire, right? Because we're going to see empires are the problem as we go forward in Genesis here. That's going to be chapter 11. We're going to see, and we've already have the first prehistoric empire. We have Cain, right? We have that's the equivalent of an empire. We'll talk more about empires next time. Empires are hard to define, but I found a pretty good definition. There's a decent, a really good modern secular Hebrew scholar who I disagree with on a lot of things, but he's still a brilliant scholar, and a futurist. So we'll talk about his definition of empires. I think it's a pretty good one. All right. Any other things about chapter 9?
Something I never thought about,
Yeah.
but apparently they must have brought a lot of seeds along in the ark with them too, because Noah planted a vineyard.
Yeah, yeah. Or just plants in general to feed the animals or whatever. You know, we're not given any of the details of how this worked.
Yeah.
It is clear that they are providentially looked over, right? And in fact, even that word, we get the word provide from providence, meaning that God's providing for them in the midst of this mysterious and miraculous thing that he calls for. But yes, but again, even there, before they start planting, when they send the dove out, it comes back with an olive branch. So clearly the plants aren't all wiped out by this experience, yeah, in whatever way, yeah. But again, that may point to why what we just read, the covenant being made with all flesh. We read these stories and we want a scientific explanation of how they worked, but that's not the reason the stories were written down. The stories were written down to communicate important whys to us, not important hows. That's actually one of the major distinctions between the Jewish literature of this period and the surrounding pagan literatures. The surrounding pagan literature is all very focused on how. How did we get the world? How did we get these people? Whatever. This is going to be much more focused on why we've got the world we have than how we got the world we have. Because from the very beginning, right, Genesis chapter 1, how did we get the world we have? God said we want it. God spoke it. God said, I want you to have this world. So that's why we have the world we have. You know? Tiamat didn't vomit up the world, and no one cut off anyone else's head, and, you know, all that stuff. Again, just very different than the surrounding literature from the Akkadians or anything like any of the other groups, any of the other people groups. Anything else? Okay. Since it is noon, why don't we wrap up there for today, and we will pick up again at chapter 10 next week.